Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Tonight, thousands of people are evacuating their homes and businesses in California as wildfires spread throughout the state. Meanwhile, Marco Rubio is self-immolating before our eyes. When Rubio traveled to New Hampshire this weekend to effectively launch his 2016 presidential campaign, he probably expected some headlines and some big interviews. What he likely did not expect is that his relaunch would be completely hijacked by one single issue.
Let me get this straight. You do not think that human activity, the production of CO2, has caused warming to our planet?
I do not believe that human activity is causing these dramatic changes to our climate the way these scientists are portraying it. That's what I do not. And I do not believe that the laws that they propose we pass will do anything about it, except it will destroy our economy.
That bit of obfuscation during an interview meant to launch his 2016 bid wasn't Rubio planning to make news or plant some kind of flag on the issue of climate change. No, it was Marco Rubio doing what every potential 2016 presidential candidate has to do as they gear up for the 2016 Koch primary, which is to simultaneously not accept the obvious scientific consensus about what's happening right in front of our eyes, while at the same time not looking like a total idiot while doing so. It's a harder dance to pull off than you might think, as Marco Rubio is finding out this week. Yesterday, Rubio headed to the National Press Club to unveil his retirement reform plan, one more step in the 2016 ramp-up. He was greeted with question after question on his comments on climate change.
Of course the climate is changing, because the climate is always changing, and that's a measurable that you can see. There is climate change. The issue is not whether the climate is changing, as it always is changing. The issue is whether there is legislative proposals before us that could do anything about it. The truth of the matter is the United States is a country. It is not a planet.
The United States is indeed a country. It is not a planet. Now, the headline out of that event was not about Rubio's retirement plan, but on Rubio's backtrack on climate change, which is actually fitting because if Rubio has his way, everyone's going to be retiring in life vests anyways. The next stop on Rubio's media tour was the more sympathetic CNBC.
Just giving you some advice. Take it from me. Just say, I believe that the climate changes, and leave it at that. It's not worth it.
Well, but I do not believe that these laws will do anything about it. I'm not going to help destroy America's economy.
I'm not.
Again, the headline out of that interview, again, is on climate change. But it didn't stop there. In his next interview with Sean Hannity, climate change comes up again. This time, Rubio tried out a different way to explain his anti-science position: abortion.
All these people always wag their finger at me about science and settled science. Let me give you a bit of settled science that they'll never admit to. Science is settled. It's not even a consensus. It is a unanimity that human life begins at conception. So I hope the next time that someone wags their finger about science, they'll ask one of these leaders on the left, do you agree with a consensus of scientists that say that human life begins at conception?
Really well said.
What we are watching right now in the last few days is something genuinely amazing and very new, especially for the Republican Party. We are watching Marco Rubio self-detonate politically over his climate denialism. Think about that for a second. A prominent Republican blowing up in front of all of us over climate denial. Now, a big part of that is that Rubio had the misfortune of timing his 2016 rollout to a real bang-up week of news in climate change.
Two groups of scientists reported today, based on close and constant examination, large parts of the western Antarctica ice sheet appears to have collapsed. The area shown here in red, scientists say further degradation is almost certainly unstoppable. They say global warming is accelerating the pace of disintegration.
In addition to the revelation that sea levels could rise 10 feet or more in the coming centuries, a report out this week authored by 16 retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals, warning that climate change is a threat to the national security of the United States that is accelerating instability in vulnerable regions and will place key elements of our national power at risk and threaten our homeland security. Another report by the International Energy Agency found that delaying in dealing with climate change comes at a cost, finding the most recent 2-year delay has added nearly $4 trillion to the cost of averting climate catastrophe. Right now, we have reached something of a consensus moment on the threat of climate change. The scientific establishment, the military establishment, even much of the business establishment understands it. Marco Rubio's last 4 days show that the Republican Party is starting to understand it. This time around, climate change will be a wedge issue for Republicans. And that's a big deal, because remember, less than 2 years ago, for Republicans, climate change was nothing more than a punchline.
President Obama promised to begin to slow the rise of the oceans and to heal the planet. My promise is to help you and your family.
Joining me now is former Congressman Bob Inglis, Republican from South Carolina, now Executive Director of the Energy and Enterprise Initiative. And Bob, you've been fighting a lonely battle to kind of get Republicans to accept the science on climate change. What do you make of Rubio's week the last few days?
Well, I think you're right that that this might be a tipping point, a place at which we begin to see the Republican Party, my party, moving more toward embracing the science because of the problem that you get into if you don't. In other words, you can't stand against the settled scientific observations that are out there. Of course, it's also true that Marco Rubio is right, that he hasn't seen a proposal yet that wouldn't have solved the problem without harming the economy. That's yet to be seen, and but it can be offered.
Okay,
it can be offered.
And you have a plan on that. It's called basically fee and dividend. You put a price on carbon and you pass the money back to taxpayers directly. You don't grow government. Right. I like that idea. I think that's a great policy solution. There's things we can quibble about. But what's so interesting is that Rubio is attempting to do two things: deny that humans putting carbon in the atmosphere is making the planet warmer, and also saying, oh, the solutions that are being proposed aren't enough. And I want him just to abandon the first. Stop with the nonsense. If you want to be a defeatist, or you want to critique the policy of cap and trade, or you want to talk about how China needs to be, under some carbon regime, that's fine. That's all sensible. But he's doing two things simultaneously that are incompatible with each other.
Well, maybe, except of course he faces a challenge in a Republican primary. He's got to win the Republican primary. So it's up to people like us at the Energy and Enterprise Initiative to show fellow conservatives that there's a solution that is based in free enterprise, passionate belief in free enterprise, and putting all the cost in on all the fuels, eliminating all the subsidies, and then watching the free enterprise system deliver innovation faster than government mandates or fickle tax incentives. That's what we've seen so far, is a lot of government. And so it's understandable why conservatives say, we're going to go back and doubt whether they've got a problem because they don't like the solution.
Right. That's exactly the way the reasoning's working.
Yeah, so we got to show a solution that fits with conservatives' deeply held beliefs. If we do that, then I think that a candidate that's facing a Republican primary electorate can say, of course we should listen to the scientist. Is the science settled? No, science is in fact never settled, but it does clearly indicate risk.
Right.
And you want to move against that risk. And so show them, what we got to do is we got to show them a solution that fits with their values.
It's so true that the reasoning all this is reasoning backwards from not liking the policies and ergo working your way back up to the science. And you see it all the time. Former Congressman Bob Inglis from the Energy and Enterprise Initiative fighting a really noble and lonely battle. And I hope you have more company in the days and months and years ahead. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Chris.
Joining me now, retired General Wesley Clark, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, presently serves as co-chair of Growth Energy, and retired Vice Admiral Lee Gunn, president of CNA Corporation's Institute for Public Research. Vice Admiral, I'll begin with you because you were part of the group that issued this report. What are the main top-line findings of the report about the connection between climate change and security?
Between the issuance of the original report from the Military Advisory Board in 2007 and now, the climate has continued to change and the pace has quickened. That means, I think, that many of the predictions we made in 2007 about the impact that America's security would feel from the changing climate have increased as well. And so the top line findings are that the population has increased dramatically in the world and that millions have moved from the inland to the seacoast and build infrastructure there and now make their lives there and depend on the existing sea level. That science has coalesced, as has previously been said in this show, about the findings that the climate is changing. We have seen evidence that climate is contributing directly to unrest.
I want to stop you there for 1 second and give a little illustration of that comes from this program, Years of Living Dangerously, I've been involved with. And General Wesley Clark, I want to get your comments on this. This is Thomas Friedman doing some reporting on the fact that before the Syrian uprising and civil war, there was actually a long period of very intense drought in Syria that kind of paved the way for some of the conditions that have given way to the unrest there. Take a look.
So is this year after year, less rain?
Year after year, government doesn't try to help in any kind of way.
And that the government's response made people so angry, they were eager to take to the streets. She said, I couldn't understand the Civil War if I didn't understand what happened in the drought. Later, I learned that this drought was the worst in Syria's modern history, and that it happened in the 4 years just before the revolution.
General Clark, the basic idea is that we're going to see more drought, more extreme weather, and that is going to stress societies in ways that will produce greater likelihoods of unrest and instability, right?
That's right. And it's happening right now. It's happening across Africa. You can be sure that some of the problem in northern Nigeria, in Niger, and the other countries south of the Sahara is that the Sahara is, that region is drying out. And the Sahara is creeping south, and people have to move, and that upsets communities and tribes and cultures. The same thing's happening in East Africa. And so already we're seeing these effects, not just in Syria, and it's going to be more widespread as the climate change continues.
Vice Admiral, is there generally consensus? I mean, do you find climate deniers in the top ranks of the Pentagon and the military establishment? Is basically regarded as a settled thing to deal with strategically, or is it something that is debated?
There is, of course, debate, and there are open minds about this topic. But military folks, by their nature, by our nature, are planners, and that is, we deal with risk. Representative Inglis talked about risk a moment ago. We plan for the worst and hope for the best. And it is important that we consider the potential and prepare for that potential. And America's military apparatus, the defense establishment, the national security apparatus are well prepared to deal with these problems on behalf of the American people. Problems like melting of the sea ice at a greater rate in the Arctic, causing security problems potentially in the Arctic that result from the access that is now opening and potentially creating a race for resources in that region.
We're likely to see a race for resources in the Arctic. General Clark, do you think there's a dynamic in which Republican politicians who often talk about the need to defer to the generals. I've heard this out of the mouths of many Republican politicians in regards to Afghanistan war planning. Is there a way that the military and national security establishment can bring them around on this issue?
There might be, but it really depends on the sources of funding for the Republican Party. And so there's some key backers of the Republican Party. They need to be talked to by the generals. They need, and it's going to be hard for them because they're making their money off industries that essentially bring that greenhouse gas to the surface and send it into the atmosphere. And so they're going to have to recognize their industry has to transform itself. That's tough.
It's not just the industry, though, of course. I'm pretty sure the largest consumer of fuel in the world is the U.S. Armed Forces. Am I right?
Well, that's true, but the U.S. Armed Forces is a very, very small consumer compared to the overall consumption in the United States. We only use about 4% of the energy in the United States. So we're not terribly significant. If you look at the source of greenhouse gases, the largest is the electric power industry.
Right.
And behind that is transportation. And, you know, I heard the conversation before. There is no legislation that's going to ruin this economy. There's no legislation out there right now.
Right.
And one of the things the Republican Party has to do is understand that when you take action against greenhouse gases to deal with climate change, you're not taking money and putting it into the ground. You're giving it to other people. You're creating jobs.
That's right.
Jobs in the wind industry, the solar industry, the electric power industry, and batteries and electric automobiles, transportation, electrified highways. These are the things that are going to make America great in the future. We've got the technology. What a terrible thing it is that we can't get investments in it in this country, and instead our friends in China put the money up, and those young technology companies are going to China. for things like how to convert CO2 into fuel, how to develop new batteries, and how to have very high voltage direct current transmission lines.
We're seeing that also in Germany and other places in the world. Retired General Wesley Clark and retired Vice Admiral Lee Gunn. Thank you, gentlemen, both.